Welcome to today's session. My name is Kendra Bosworth and I'm the Manager of Professional Development and Programs at ACSL, and I'll be facilitating this session. Also from ACSL, we have Kat Beavis, our Manager of Communications, who will be assisting through the session. If you've got any questions or need help, please reach out to us through the chat. Before we start, I recognise that I am facilitating this session from the Gundungurra country and the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you're all joining from today. We honour the First Nations people, culture and connection to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. ACSL acknowledges the lifelong trauma of abuse victims and survivors and their families. The failure of the Catholic Church to protect, believe and respond justly to children and adults at risk, and the consequent breaches of community trust. Please be aware that this session may contain content that you find confronting. If you start to feel distressed, please use your own judgment and ensure you are safe. It's okay to withdraw if you need to, and you can find support resources on the ACSL website. So today, I'm very pleased to present our presenter. that's a great sentence, Kendra. Dr. Judith Howard. Dr. Judith Howard is an Associate Professor in the School of Early Childhood and Inclusive Education at Queensland University of Technology. She comes from an extensive career history with schooling in Queensland, where she's worked as a teacher, guidance counsellor and behaviour support specialist, and has held both regional and state leadership positions, overseeing work and student behaviour support. At QUT, Dr. Howard oversees pre-service and postgraduate courses in trauma-aware education and has developed online courses that are reaching thousands nationally and internationally. She's received a National Award for University Teaching in 2022 for her work in this area. Judith is also the founder and principal chair of the large biennial Trauma-Aware Education Conference held in Brisbane and at the end of October, and she will give us a little bit more information about that too. So with all that being said, I'd like to say welcome, Dr. Judith Howard.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for taking time off during your busy lives and busy days to spend some time with me today. And thank you for all of those who are watching this recording to take that you're taking time to do that as well. This area of work that I am very passionate about and very busy in is important in so many ways for our children and young people in our country, but also for quite a significant number of adults out there who've lived through childhood trauma. So I'm going to focus today mostly on the education context, but what I'm talking about has huge implications for not only children, young people, but also for all the grown-ups out there. So I'm going to share my screen with you. Hopefully this all works nicely. Okie doke. So we're going to rush through stuff today, but we're going to look at this thing that we've identified as trauma-aware education. That's how we've branded it for our country. Different other parts of the world talk about this using different terms like trauma-informed, trauma-sensitive, etc. We in Australia have branded it as trauma-aware because we really value and recognise the awareness part, where people, once they're aware of the impacts of trauma on the developing nervous systems of young people, it makes so much of a difference in terms of what we do as educators and supporters of these kids. So we're going to look at the theory and the science really briefly that informs trauma-aware education, a quick look at how it's done, or what are the key ideas there, and at the end of this morning, I'll share some resources that might be able to help you in this space. We've already had our acknowledgement to country, but I'll just add that I'm coming to you from the lands of the Gubbi people, and I work at QUT, which is on the lands of the Turrbal and Yuggera people. So very grateful to our traditional owners. So if this is the first time you've been hearing about, I know you've obviously been listening to many conversations about the impact of harm on kids throughout, in historical contexts, etc. But this might be I don't know, but it might be the first time you've actually looked at the science. So it's going to be a bit of a crash course. I'm not going to be going into a real lot of detail, but I do encourage, if you're really interested in this space, I encourage you to look further, and I'll share some ideas that might help you with that at the end of today. So my story, you've heard a little bit from Kendra, but I started off as a classroom teacher, then moved into counselling because I just figured I just seem to always attract those kids that were with high level behaviours who were really challenging, were always getting suspended and excluded. And I was getting very frustrated with my lack of capacity to help them enough. So I went into school counselling thinking I would fix all the problems of the world, and found very quickly that I didn't have enough time to do that. And so I ended up doing other work, in particular, developing training programs to help people understand what's going on with these kids. And some very clear patterns came up as I was working in, across regions in Queensland initially with high level cases. And the pattern was clear that almost always these kids who are so at risk and doing such difficult things at school and being kicked out of school, almost always they had lived through complex childhood trauma. So I realized that the old ways we were doing this thing called education just weren't working for these kids. We needed to shift in our thinking, and we needed to really believe that these kids were worth it, rather than them being placed too readily in the too hard basket. So as a result of that, for the last, 20 years or so, I've been working in this space of trauma-aware education. As I developed all these training programs over the years, people would line up afterwards and they would say these things to me. And again, these were clear patterns that have made me work in particular spaces to address these concerns. I had a lot of young teachers coming up to me and saying, well, how come I didn't learn this at university? Why is this the first time I've heard this stuff? I had established leaders in schools, principals, or people who had taught for a long time, who said to me, I wish I'd known this years ago. I would have done things so much, in such a different way for those particular kids. Or teachers saying, I wish I knew this with that kid, that particular young person. I wish I'd known it. So I could have worked differently. And I also had increasingly people coming up to me and saying, that childhood trauma stuff you've been talking about today, that's my story. And there were it was very, very obvious that quite significant numbers of people who are working in schools and early childhood services had lived through complex childhood trauma themselves. And yet something had happened in their lives to turn things around so that they chose a career where they would help other kids, which I find intriguing, and I'm determined to write a book about them one day. I actually see them as the evidence that this stuff works. I would love for that to be what all our trauma-impacted young people get at the end of their education. So the more I worked in this space, the more I realized this was a systemic problem. It's not just a teacher's problem or a school's problem. It's a system problem. It's a country's problem. It's organizational. It's all those sorts of things. So there's this systemic stuff that needs to be addressed. And it requires this multifaceted systemic solution, which is pretty much where I'm working now. I work across at the level of systems problem solving, or that sort of thing. So I'm going to start with this funny little graph that I always share with groups I speak to. And it's a little graph that shows the difference between what we sometimes refer to as simple trauma and what we refer to as complex trauma. And it's a really nice way for you to share with your colleagues these messages, because it's so simple to look at, but it has very clear learnings attached to it. So if you look at the blue line, right down the bottom, that's where a young baby's born, and right up the top is the end of that person's life. And you can see as life goes on, there are some dips in the blue line. Now, because the line is going up and up and up, that's representing developmental gains in that person's life. So the older we get, the more we gain developmentally. But every so often we dip, and that's when this thing called simple trauma happens, which is usually a time-limited, non-relational harm, but something's happened in the lives of people which is not okay, and we suffer. It's traumatic, it's awful, but it's time-limited, and it's usually a one-off thing. So for children in classrooms, for example, it might be mum and dad are breaking up, or it might be, grandma just died, or something like that, or even being suspended or excluded from school. For a period of time, these kids dip developmentally, and they're not achieving what they should be achieving at that period of their life because of what they're going through. Now, because these kids are often surrounded by wonderful people like yourselves and parents, carers, grandparents, etc., who are totally invested in helping them get better, they do get better, they get back up to where they need to be on that blue line, and off they go again. That's simple trauma. Now, complex trauma is more about really significant and repeated relational harm. So you can see with the red line, which is representative of complex trauma, even way back in the start of life, the red line is below the blue line. So developmentally, these kids are not achieving the same as their same age peers. And that's because of what's happening to them and around them. And you'll notice there are more dips in the red line. And that's because complex trauma, which I'll define in a minute, actually leads to more incidences of simple trauma. So more often will a child who's lived through complex trauma, will the people that they need to love and nurture and protect them, more often will they go away and not come back. Or more often will they be excluded from school or be in hospital due to injury or go hungry or whatever it is. So there's more incidences of simple trauma. And the recovery from that is not as neat as it is on the blue line. And that's because very often these kids do not have that predictable, effective network of grown-ups around them who help them to get better again from that, particularly our children who are in the care of the state. So you can see it's a bit of a jagged trajectory for these kids. And if you look at the green line there, let's say that's the end of high school, there's a big difference between what the blue line and the red line. So when these kids are leaving us at the end of their education, developmentally, they're going to really struggle with achieving what we would love for all of our graduates, which is, things like getting a job, going on to study, having a safe network of friends, having an intimate relationship that's safe and effective, and, parenting in an adaptive way. All those sorts of things can be out of reach of young people who I refer to as unresolved from the impacts of complex trauma. So that little graph is a way of showing the difference between the two. From an educator's perspective, our job, we can't stop all the harm that happens to kids. We'd love to, but we can't do it. But what we can do, if we embed what I'm asking educators to do in trauma-aware education, is we can lift that red line closer to the blue line, so that by the time these kids leave us at the end of high school, they're far more likely to be achieving those lovely developmental milestones that we would want for all our graduates. So complex childhood trauma, unfortunately, is two things. The first is early exposure to ongoing and repeated interpersonal traumatic experience, things like physical and emotional and sexual abuse, things like significant neglect, family violence, all that sort of thing. That's number one. But it's also a second thing, and that is the longer term impacts of this. So this is what we deal with in classrooms. So even if kids are no longer experiencing that harm, they can still be experiencing the longer term impacts of this. And this is where the science I'm going to quickly throw at you today is really important, because what we're being very clearly told is that type of harm early in life can have an impact on developing nervous systems. And that can then have an impact on these three, I call these the big three, when they come to school. One is they can have trouble perceiving safety, feeling safe coming through the gate at school, going into the classroom, past the classroom door, being with teachers. They can feel very, very unsafe. They can have a lot of trouble with attaching to people and relating and bonding, and a lot of trouble with their emotional self-regulation. And because of all, if you're having trouble in those three areas, safety, relationships, and emotional regulation, you're probably going to play up a lot at school and get into a lot of trouble at school. And that's why these young kids are so highly represented in our suspension and exclusion data, which is definitely not okay. And of course, as we all know, there's additional trauma now that's going on across our country and across our world. We've got our natural disasters. We had that nasty pandemic. all of these things have led to a rise in domestic and family violence that is truly upsetting, a rise in child maltreatment. And of course, we've got international war and conflict. And because of all these things, we see these really worrying increasing levels of anxiety with young people and with their parents and carers. And this is leading to a worrying impact on parenting and caring, and maybe a cyclical impact that then leads to more harm for kids. So it's definitely not looking good, but we all have to hold hands as people who know that to address this stuff is really, really vital. And I know many of you are listening today, work in lots of different areas and fields. My field is education, so I've been able to take the reins and lead that for Australia. And I'll quickly share that, a little bit of that later today. So there's loads and loads of research. I won't go through it, but I just want to put this slide up to show you that I'm not making this up. You know, we don't just think this is a nice thing to do to sad, poor kids. It's not that at all. And it's not being soft or letting them get away with stuff or anything like that. It's definitely informed by really solid research and really solid science. One of the original studies most of you have probably heard of is the Adverse Childhood Experience study that changed our thinking when it came to child maltreatment. We initially used to think of it as a social problem. You know, only a certain group of people experience this social problem. But this study in the 1990s, the first time it was done, it showed that this stuff called adverse childhood experience is very widespread across all stratas of society. No one area of society is less vulnerable than any other. We all experience this thing called adverse childhood experience. And also it showed, the ACE study showed that the more types of ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, that one person experienced, the more likely they were to experience all these things that are on this pyramid in front of you, including disease and disability and high-risk behaviours, and even getting so sick that they die earlier than they need to. Really significant stuff. So this study shook us up, and we started to think that this child maltreatment thing is not just a social problem, it's actually a health problem. It's very expensive, and governments need to listen to this, because when there's a lot of dollars associated with these significant health issues that are associated with high ACE scores, things like cancer and obesity and smoking and all this sort of stuff. There've been multiple studies. So, you know, this study really changed our thinking, thankfully, and made us take more notice of this thing called child maltreatment. There's also looking at the stats, or the prevalence of this stuff really justifies that the education system or systems really need to, you know, take a hold of this and do something about it. So even just our child protection data in our country basically says that 1 in every 32 children have been identified as experiencing this thing called child maltreatment. And then there's the ACMS, the Australian Child Maltreatment Study. It was run by my university, and the results came out last year. And the link there, if you go into that site, you'll see all sorts of papers and infographics and evidence and all that sort of thing. But in summary, it basically looked at the proportion of adults in our country who had lived through the various types of child maltreatment that are up on the screen there before they turned 18. And when the data came out, we were it was kind of expected, but not expected. It was expected, but at the same time, we were really, really saddened to know that that proportion of people who we work with day in, day out, or who we connect with, had experienced this thing called child maltreatment. So it's definitely not rare. And we have trends. So our kids, our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students, kids in remote areas, and kids who live in poverty are far more vulnerable to this thing called child maltreatment. And you know, we've got plenty of kids who are living in kinship care, and about 20% of those in kinship care are living with grandparents. I'm a grandmother of 7, and I can just think how hard it would be to raise your grandchildren, particularly after raising your own children who had experienced difficulties that had led to child protection concerns. So it's really concerning. And a high proportion of young people in our youth justice system and even adults in jail have also had a history of complex trauma. And unfortunately, there's a bunch of kids out there who we just don't know about yet. They're sitting in our classrooms, but they have not yet been identified. So the big messages I try and get out there again and again is the numbers we know about is an underestimate of the true numbers of young kids out there who have experienced this thing called child maltreatment. And therefore, all schools, all early childhood services, and I would suggest all universities and higher education organisations should be trauma aware. So if we go back to the science tells us why this happens to kids and adults, and it also tells us how we should be responding. So in a very brief way, the science tells us that complex trauma can impact on the development and functioning of the early brain and the entire nervous system, even to the cellular levels, and even further to the genetic levels. So what we see in classrooms are bodies and behaviours. That's the macro level. But this stuff is telling us what's going on inside nervous systems, right down to the genetic level. And it tells us that this concerning impact can mess with things like memory, executive functioning, emotional regulation, relationships, feeling safe, language, and therefore with behaviour and learning. So, no wonder these kids have trouble sticking out their education journey without getting into a lot of trouble. And if it's not resolved, this can have an impact on education outcomes, but also life outcomes and future parenting, which is concerning. And some of our traditional approaches that we've always depended on to do this thing called behaviour management and to do this thing called learning have not worked with these kids. And they actually sometimes have made things worse. So it's definitely a case of changing our thinking about this. And this approach that I'm talking about today has a greater likelihood of addressing those longer term education and life impacts of complex trauma. And this is growing in understanding across our country, which is wonderful, and it's impacting on policy and practice across our country. So if we look at just a little bit of the science that underpins this, you've got your nervous system is made up of all different bits and pieces, and some of you will be very familiar with this. But there's the central nervous system, which is brain, spinal cord, and all the cellular stuff inside those bits. And then there's the peripheral nervous system, which is all the cellular stuff outside those bits. And the peripheral nervous system can be broken down into further chunks. There's the somatic nervous system, which helps us receive and interpret and respond to sensory information in our world. There's the autonomic nervous system, which is really important to understand in this work because it's all about survival. And it includes two further chunks in those pink boxes there, the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system. Now, the sympathetic nervous system is referred to as the accelerator. So it is the part of our nervous system that takes off when we perceive a threat. And we respond, our body and all the bits within our nervous system just spark because we're perceiving a threat. And how we tend to respond is in one of three ways: fight, flight, or freeze. And that's the response in the sympathetic nervous system. So it's known as the accelerator. The parasympathetic nervous system is the brake. So its job is to settle things down again. Once a threat's been perceived and everything takes off, it settles things down. Now, because my autonomic nervous system is healthy and strong and robust, when I perceive a threat that's not really threatening, I will very quickly calm down. And that's because my accelerator and brake work nicely together. That for unresolved trauma-impacted children, young people, and even adults, those two parts of their nervous system can be out of whack. And they can have a really hard time reaching what I call a homeostasis, where the sympathetic and the parasympathetic work so nicely together that they achieve balance mentally, physically, emotionally, relationally, behaviourally. They're balanced. But for our unresolved trauma victims, they can just be out of whack with that, and they have a lot of difficulty achieving this thing called homeostasis. Now, if we quickly look at the central nervous system, it's just, when I talk to educators, I just touch on a few bits of the brain, really, because they don't need to know everything, but they do need to know a little bit. And the first part they need to know about is the brain stem, which is the part that connects your brain to your spinal cord. And it starts as this tiny little microscopic tube the moment a baby is conceived, and that will eventually develop into a brain stem. And it develops really, really quickly in utero, so that by the time a baby's born, this part of the brain is almost done and dusted. It's nicely developed. It's quite sophisticated. And that's really important because the job of the brain stem is survival. So it helps to keep your heart beating. It helps to keep you breathing, all that physical survival stuff. It's also the center of the fight, flight, and freeze response, so the autonomic nervous system. So this part of your brain is on fire when you're feeling those responses, fight, flight, or freeze. And it's the bridge between brain and body. So it's all, you know, it's the part that basically gets the brain to talk to the body, body to talk to the brain. Really important part of the brain, which is why it needs to develop really quickly from the moment of conception. So yeah, it's developed almost fully by the time a baby is born. Then the cerebellum is just above the brainstem at the back of your head here, and it looks after human movement. So it's about a tenth of the size of your brain, but it has about half of the cells in your brain packed in there. It's really, really dense, and that's because it's got a big job to do. It's got to do all this stuff around movement for us. And it takes a good 3 years to get to a reasonable level of maturity in human babies. Not so with other animals. Other animals can move quite quickly to protect themselves, to get food, to do all those sorts of things after birth. But our human babies take a long, long time. And that is why this thing called attachment is so vital. Because if we don't attach and bond and connect and protect our little ones, this species called the human race would not survive because of it. We have a very immature cerebellum. So the attachment phenomenon is so important. If your brain's in two halves or hemispheres, and right in the middle of each of those halves is this lovely thing called the limbic system, which has lots of bits and pieces. But I just want to focus on two parts today that are helpful for educators and everybody, really. I want to talk about the amygdala and the hippocampus. Now, the amygdala, we refer to that as a fire alarm. It's like a little, as soon as someone perceives a threat, this is the very first part of the brain that sparks, and it sends a message messages really, really quickly to the brainstem that responds in the fight, flight, and freeze ways. So it's definitely a fire alarm. It helps us, again, it's all about keeping us safe. But it sparks when we perceive something. And then there's this other part called the hippocampus, which is right next door to the amygdala. It's a C-shaped part of the brain, and its job is memory. So it's all about encoding and storing and retrieving memories, processing memory, using memory. Now, because these two little bits are next door neighbours, the cells within them talk to each other all day, every day. And as a result of that, we experience this thing called emotional memory, which is, we all do. If you think back to something that happened to you in high school that was embarrassing, you might feel that embarrassment today, or you might feel that in your body. And we like to refer to this as the body remembering. The physiological part of you actually recalls what happened then through the way the hippocampus and the amygdala are talking to each other. Now, that's okay. We can deal with that because we can achieve homeostasis most of the time in our lives. But for unresolved trauma survivors, this is a real concern because they have some really significant memories of harm that happened a while back. And these memories tend to be a bit murky and muddy. They're not easily verbalized. They sometimes are non-verbal memories because when the harm happened, they hadn't actually developed to the period where they could use language. So there's murky, muddy memories, but they still have a powerful impact on how the body remembers. So unfortunately, when the amygdala picks up a perceived threat that may or may not be a true threat, messages can shoot, because of this interaction between this memory center and the fire alarm, these messages can shoot very quickly to the brainstem, and we can see a reaction in children, young people, and even unresolved trauma victims who are adults. Now, importantly, the limbic system takes a good 3 years to develop after birth, and there's a whole lot of development going on during that time. The last part I like to talk about is the prefrontal cortex, and this is the part under your forehead that is basically only found in human beings, not in other animals. And it's all about higher level thinking, decision making, choosing, problem solving, executive function, all those higher level cortical functions. That's the job of the prefrontal cortex. And when the prefrontal cortex is really well developed and is doing its job well, it actually manages all the other parts of the nervous system. So it's got a big job to do. Now, this part takes a lot longer to get to a good level of sophistication, often to the mid to late 20s. And this is why working with adolescents or raising adolescents can be a little bit challenging at times, because they have sometimes a resurgence of limbic activity where they're emotional and they're relational and all this, but they're not thinking things through. So they're taking risks and not thinking about consequences and things like that. And I like to refer to this as the time of life where they need to borrow our prefrontal cortexes to get them through, whether we're parenting them or we're teaching them or we're supporting them in some way. It's a rocky road, adolescence, but it's an important part of development too. Now, we've looked at bodies and behaviors that we might see in a classroom. We've looked at parts of the nervous system and the different chunks and parts of the brain. I just want to take you on a quick journey to look at the cells now, because this is important. The cells that make up the nervous system. There's an easy diagram for you to see on the left of the screen there that just shows the different bits and pieces. But basically, those branchy looking things called dendrites collect electrical information from neighboring cells, drag it down that long journey down that axon, and then out the other end of that other branchy looking structure and to the terminal buttons. Now, this is normal, happens all day, every day, in every cell, every neuron in our nervous system. Now, when an electrical impulse hits a terminal button, have a look on the right side of the screen. So there's a close-up of a terminal button. There's these little pockets on the end, and inside each of those little pockets, they're called synaptic vesicles, just a multitude of these magical, wonderful chemicals called neurotransmitters. And when the electrical impulse hits, these pop out and they do a little dance in that tiny microscopic gap between the terminal button of one cell and the dendrites of the next cell. And depending on how they react, that cell, the first cell, might ignite, if you like, an electrical chemical response in the next cell. And then that might happen again to another cell and another cell and another cell. And when that happens over and over and over, we get this thing called neural development happening. So after a baby is born, from the moment they are born, they are bombarded with sensory information, which is the somatic nervous system. And their nervous system responds to that really quickly by sending messages up and down their nervous system. And very, very quickly, cells are talking to cells and that's happening over and over again. And pathways develop, neural pathways. And then those pathways end up connecting with other pathways and neural networks develop. And very, very quickly, that little brain that was not too dense when a baby was born, it becomes really dense with neural matter. And by the time they're 3 or a little bit older than that, they've got a very, very dense brain full of neural matter, networks, and all these things that have happened as they respond to their world. Now, that's fine, but if we had a brain that dense now, we'd be behaving like a 3 to 6 year old. So that's not okay. Something else has to happen. And that's this thing called neural pruning, which generally a lot happens over the period of adolescence. And that's where all the pathways that the nervous system suggests, oh, that's good, we'll keep that. That's really important. That's had loads and loads of information and lots of reinforcement will hang on to those bits. But the parts that didn't get lots of reinforcement, the brain and the nervous system get rid of those. And it's called pruning. So those bits go, the brain keeps the bits that are deemed as important. And that's okay, because once we get through that process, we end up with a nicely developed and nicely functioning adult brain that does what is adaptive for us, which is how brains are supposed to develop. If we go back to the time of early childhood, there's this phenomenon called attachment you've probably heard of. I'm not going to go into the types of attachment, but I'm going to talk about the science that underpins it just very, very briefly. So this is where we're interacting with little people, little infants and young children, and as their carers or their friends or their grandparents or whoever we are, when we're interacting with them, this magical stuff's going on in little brains. And this is what's referred to as the mirror neuron network. So if you've ever picked up a little baby and looked into their eyes, you start, doing silly things. You send out all this social information through your face and through your voice and all this sort of stuff. And that's because the mirror neuron networks that manage your relational stuff are firing like crazy as you're interacting with that little baby. Almost immediately, the same types of networks in the same parts of Bubby's brain are going to fire. And as a result, that little one is going to respond in a way that almost mimics the social information you're giving out. So you can see it in these photographs where, babies might open their mouths or open their eyes or make silly noises or whatever. They're reacting in a way that there's a lovely giving and receiving of social information. It can be happy stuff, it can be sad stuff, it can be whatever, but there's nice back and forth giving and receiving, which is great for developing brains. And I have a very sophisticated, you have a very sophisticated mirror neuron network now, because I've had loads and loads of practice from when I was born. And that's what we want for all our little people, for all our adolescents and for all our adults, to have loads of practice so that they're really good at receiving and giving out social cues in an adaptive and helpful way. Now, as little ones get bigger, they start to move. Their cerebellum is developing and they start, hopping and jumping and climbing, doing all that cool stuff. And what happens then is our job as the adults working with them changes. We become what's called a secure base and a safe haven. So as a secure base, my job is to build up the courage of little people I'm looking after, so that they will separate from me physically and go out and explore their environment. So I will use my face, my voice, what I do to build up their courage to go, off you go and play. And that's good. I also need to be a safe haven, because if something goes wrong, they get a fright or anything like that, I need to be that one who they can come back to, and we can co-regulate emotions together. And I'll again use my body, my voice and all that sort of thing, and we'll co-regulate emotions, because at that age, they're too little to regulate their emotions on their own. So we'll do it together, body to body. Now, this is really important because during this period of life, kids who get repeated access to this stuff develop the capacity to learn because they're engaging with their environment, to relate because they're engaging with other human beings, and to emotionally regulate because they're getting lots of practice with co-regulation. Okay. So attachment theory basically says that there's a number of bits and pieces that are pretty much givens if you have a healthy attachment start to life. There's also, unfortunately, some different experiences and reactions for our little ones who live through complex trauma. So this comes from John Bowlby and other attachment theorists. Basically, it says that a healthy attachment leads to kids feeling confident and secure in relatively safe places, like a kindergarten or a school or a playground. But our kids who've lived through complex trauma don't feel safe. They are very anxious and fearful, even in non-threatening environments. So they get very worried right from, you can even take the pulses of some of these kids when they're sleeping, and they can be racing because of the amount of stress hormones still surging around their bloodstreams. Healthy attachment leads to that ready exploration of the environment. So that leads to healthy cognitive and social development. They're learning, they're connecting. But our kids who don't go through that have disrupted or reduced access to their environment, and that can impact on their learning capacities and their social capacities. For our healthy attachment kids, trusting grown-ups is pretty mostly usual, but for our complex trauma victims, it's mostly unusual. So it's really hard for them to trust their teacher or their teacher aide or the youth worker or whoever's working with them, because all the evidence in their life has basically led to them believing that you can't trust grown-ups. Healthy attachment leads to that effective management of impulses and emotions, but our kids from complex trauma backgrounds have a lot of trouble with self-regulation. They're easily stressed, they're easily angry, impulsive, and it can take a lot of time and a lot of effort to bring them down. And you've even got, big kids in high school who still need co-regulation because their nervous system hasn't had that practice to be good at self-regulation. So they need us to help them regulate their emotions. Healthy attachment leads to the development of these lovely things called empathy and compassion, which is part of the the mirror neurons job. But our complex trauma kids, there's a lot of difficulty with those things, and they have a lot of trouble understanding your needs, your experiences, your facial expressions. And so that leads to you feeling like they don't get you, that they lack empathy, you don't want to be around them. Those unfortunate things can be part of being unresolved from trauma. Healthy attachment leads to people and their intentions, children thinking people and their intentions are mostly good, but it's the opposite for our other kids who think that people are out there mostly going to do harm. So they're on guard a lot, which is why they very quickly go into a fight or flight response or freeze response. And they also healthy attachment leads to the development of resilience, if you like, during tough times, which is the blue line dips. But our unresolved trauma kids, they don't recover quite as well, which is that red line. So if we look at, we've talked about bodies and whole bodies and behaviors, we've talked about the nervous system and the brain, we've looked at the cells within that. For all of those bits and pieces to work well, the big parts, the neurons need to be working well. And for the neurons to be healthy and doing their job well, all the other magical stuff that I won't even go into today, there's hormones and enzymes and all these other things that look after neurons, they need to be doing their job well. And when all of those are doing their job well, that's when we get to this thing called homeostasis, which I mentioned right at the beginning. So this is giving you a cellular explanation for the same stuff I've been talking from the moment we started today. Now, the green information here is important. Excessive, detrimental, and lasting stress that's referred to as toxic stress that's associated with childhood trauma can impact on all these things, from whole bodies and behaviours, whole nervous systems, brains, and the cells within those parts. And therefore, it can mess with homeostasis. And toxic stress is referred to as the extreme, frequent, or extended activation of the neurobiological stress response. And this part's important, without the buffering presence of a supportive adult. So kids are dealing with it on their own. So this little girl in pink, she has had loads of experience with the mirror neuron, back and forth, reading and responding to cues, all that stuff right from the moment she was born. She's had lots of secure base and safe haven stuff where she's gone out and explored her environment. She's developed cognitively and socially, and she's always had somewhere to go to who will help her with co-regulating her emotions. So all the pathways in her brain that we would love to see nice and strong and resilient are getting all that attention. A little girl in black and white here, living in a complex trauma context, very ineffective access to the mirror neuron stuff, very ineffective access to the secure base safe haven stuff, can have an impact not only on how her brain and nervous system is developing, but also on her capacity for relearning, relationships, emotional regulation, perceiving safety, all those things, if something's not done about it. This picture here is quite well known. It came out of some pretty significant research into the Romanian orphanages studies, and you might have heard of some of those. And I won't go into the detail of those studies today, I don't have time. But the photographs here sort of give you an idea of what the impact of relational neglect can be. So if you look at the top photograph, it's basically a scanner from the top looking down, And at the top of the photograph is the prefrontal cortex, and down the bottom is the brainstem. And for kids who have lived through or are living with the impacts of childhood trauma, and in this case it's neglect, the brainstem is on overload. It's busy, 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 because its job is to keep you safe, to help you survive. So for kids who are experiencing relational neglect, that part of the brain will be busy, 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 trying to get them keep the heart beating, keep them, functioning, all that sort of thing. For those who are experiencing maltreatment in various ways, that part will be busy, 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 trying to keep them reacting to perceived threat. Now, when that part is really busy, what happens is the activity in the prefrontal cortex shuts down. And this is how our brains work. So when you're really anxious about something, you won't think clearly, because that part of your brain is going quieter. Or when you're really calm and everything's feeling lovely and your brainstem's nice and relaxed, you get very creative and you solve all the problems of the world, because your prefrontal cortex is very, very active. Now, this is how our brains work. What we want for all the children in all our classrooms is a really active prefrontal cortex, because that's the part that connects to the curriculum and helps with learning and engagement. But if their brain stems are on fire because they are feeling unsafe, unsupported, all the rest of it, we're not going to get very far. So a big push within this approach that we're talking about today is to help with calming brain stems first, so that we can then have prefrontal cortexes that can do the job of educating, of learning and teaching and all the rest. So this little slide here basically shows the behavior of two stress hormones that surge around our bodies when we're highly stressed, all of us. The purple line refers to adrenaline, the yellow line refers to cortisol. And when we're really highly stressed, we surge with these chemicals, our bloodstreams do. Now, if there's a kid at school that's really gone off and there's an explosive behavior of sorts, you'll know when they're surging with adrenaline, because that's usually when the behavior's at its worst. And when the behavior drops down, as the purple line does here, you can tell the adrenaline's dropping off because the behaviors are dropping off. But the yellow line represents cortisol, and it's a very significant stress hormone that behaves very differently to adrenaline. So it builds up more slowly in the brain and takes a lot longer to come down over time. And what we deal with at school when a student's really gone off is we often, when the purple lines drop down and the adrenaline's dropped off, we usually make decisions to go in and do our thing called behavior management at that point. So we might question kids or discipline kids or whatever we do, because we feel it's a safe place to do that now because they're not behaving badly anymore. But look at the yellow line at that point. The science is telling us that we need to give these kids a lot more time to get rid of that significant amount of stress hormone in their nervous systems, so that their brain stems will settle and their prefrontal cortexes will come back online, so that we can then engage with them to help them with any future behaviours. So I refer to this, and this is why there's some glasses on the screen here. I refer to this as taking off our behaviourist lenses and popping on our neuroscience lenses. If I have my behaviourist lenses, which is basically how we were trained at university, that we need to work on reinforcing the behaviours we want to see, extinguishing the behaviours we don't want to see, and we do it by manipulating the external worlds of students through rules and regulations and activities and all these things we do to help with that. Works beautifully with most kids, really does. But for these kids, it almost always fails. And that's because of what's going on inside the bodies of these kids. So no matter how much effort we do with manipulating their environments to encourage and extinguish behaviours, if we don't work on what's going on inside, we're going to still see the concerns. So this is where I suggest we take off our behaviourist lenses for these kids, pop on our neuroscience, so consider the science. So for this little guy, say there's a little kid here who's totally gone off, swearing, throwing stuff, all the rest of it, and now the purple lines dropped down, he's calmed down. I would recommend letting him engage with some sort of a calming, pleasurable and preferred activity at that time, until the cortisol's dropped off. Now, if I was wearing my behaviorist lenses, I would interpret that as bad practice, that I'm reinforcing bad behavior or rewarding bad behavior. But if I change my lenses and I pop on my neuroscience lenses, what I'm doing here is waiting for the cortisol to drop off so that the brainstem will calm down, so the prefrontal cortex comes back online so that I can engage with that student again. So it's a whole different way of understanding how to do this thing called behavior management with kids at school. And it applies throughout life, really. Other area of science I'm going to really quickly touch on, because it is important when it comes to parenting, is this area called epigenetics. So this is explaining the intergenerational transmission of this thing called complex trauma. Epigenetics basically looks at what's going on inside the nucleus, inside the cell body of neurons. So the nucleus is right inside there, and inside there is a whole lot of genetic material. And that includes these things called chromosomes. Now, chromosomes are made up of these structures called histones. Wrapped around the histones is this stringy stuff called DNA, or deoxyribonucleic acid. And that's all wrapped around. And then on the DNA are these little singular units of hereditary information that are called genes. So we've got all these lovely things inside the nucleus of all our cells. Now, I like to talk about this in this way. The day I'm born, I inherit what is I refer to as a picnic basket of genetic material from my biological parents. So I have that. I've inherited those two pieces of genetic information, and that's what I start with. But as life goes on and I experience life, that changes. And we know from the science now that experiences, what we go through in life, changes the structure and the functioning of genes in our picnic basket. And that's, we used to talk about, is it nurture or nature? We don't have that argument anymore. It's both. So as I go through positive experiences in life, my genes will adapt. As I go through negative experiences in my life, my genes will adapt. And that's part of going through life. And so the day I give birth to a child, that child's going to be born with their picnic basket, which will be a combination of what's called my epigenome. So I start with a genome the day I'm born, and then things change and it becomes an epigenome over life. My child will be born with a combination of my epigenome and my husband's epigenome, and that will become their genome. And so that's how intergenerational transmission of genetic information happens, which happens to all of us, which is fine. That's how life goes on. So there's some bad news and good news here. The bad news is negative experiences early in life, particularly when the brain is developing really rapidly, can lead to epigenetic changes that influence the instructions that genes give to the rest of our bodies. And this could impact on things like feeling safe, relationships, being able to emotionally regulate, being resilient, all those sorts of things. So genes are quite vulnerable to this thing called toxic stress, and that can be transmitted intergenerationally. So that's not okay. However, there's some lovely news, and that is that genes respond beautifully to supportive and nurturing experiences. And this happens in early childhood, throughout adolescence, but also throughout life. So this is great news. The way we support each other, the way we support our clients, the way we support our students, particularly if we're aware of the science of complex trauma, can actually change the stories for these people. And this is why I keep doing what I'm doing, because I'm extremely hopeful that we can change the stories. Despite the awful start to life that some people have had, we can certainly change the story if we're helping them to function in this way. So this thing called trauma-aware education, teachers and others don't need to be experts in the science. They just need to be aware and supported to respond in an informed way. So it's not a program, it's not an extra piece of work for busy teachers. It's a way of thinking, believing, planning and acting so that we are better supporting those kids who've lived through complex trauma. And it focuses on those big three: safety, relationships and emotional regulation. And it does this thing called widening the window of tolerance. And this is a metaphor by a fellow called Dan Siegel. And he suggests that we've all got a window of tolerance. And on this diagram, our window is contained through the top dotted line and the bottom dotted line. And the yellow line shows all the ups and downs of life we go through. We all do this. But when our ups and downs are contained within our window, we'll be okay. We're still not fun, but we'll be okay. But sometimes, particularly with unresolved trauma survivors, the window gets smaller and tighter. And so more often do they crash through the ceiling and drop through the floor. And when they crash through the ceiling, that's when they head into this thing called fight and flight. And when they drop through the floor, that's when they head into this thing called freeze. So they're referred to as hyperarousal and hypoarousal. The work I'm encouraging in all schools and all early childhood programs and all universities really is to broaden the windows of our trauma survivors. So through what we do with them day in, day out, and all the trauma informed work we do with them, we're actually widening their windows of tolerance. So even though they still have the ups and downs, they're less likely to crash through the ceiling or drop through the floor and experience hyper and hypoarousal. So that's a metaphor that helps educators in particular understand why we do this work. So in this work, because these are the three big areas kids suffer, these are the three big areas we focus on. And it starts with professional learning. We try and get professional learning out there for leadership of schools, etc., and staff. And we start to problematize, which is a word my grandchildren tell me is not a real word, but that's okay. We start to problematize the ways we've thought and believed and planned and acted in the past. And we go, well, what about these kids? And we need to look at our policy, for example, behavior management policy, because it's very powerful and it can either enhance the support for these kids or it can absolutely inhibit it. So we do need to look at policy, trauma-informed case management, and then strategies. You know, what strategies are we going to put in place? I have no time to talk to you about that today, and I know most of you are probably interested in it, but there's a whole lot of activity that we can do to help kids develop the capacity for feeling safe, for relationships and emotional regulation. We also want to help build a vocabulary across schools, for example, so that everyone, staff and students, all understand the bits of the brain and the nervous system that we're working on, and also this stuff called emotional regulation and dysregulation, so that we can all talk about it, not just our trauma-impacted kids, but everyone. And we also want strategies to help our grown-ups at schools to manage their nervous systems, because that's really important. You need a healthy adult nervous system to be able to work with a dysregulated student's nervous system. We also ask schools to problematize some areas of the curriculum that could be doing harm. We are obliged to stick to the Australian curriculum in schools, but some of the content and how it is delivered can actually lead to more harm. For example, in early years of schooling, you know, there's a lot of lovely stuff around who is my family, you know, let's do a family tree, let's bring in a baby photo, all this sort of stuff can be really concerning if you've come from a history where relational harm was done at the hands of those who should have been nurturing and protecting and loving you. So we need to be careful about this, you know, in secondary school, giving oral autobiographies, or in science, looking at genetic stuff and all this, we need to be cautious, and we can still deliver the curriculum, but we can fiddle with it to do no harm. And I do spend a lot of time talking to educators about that. And also looking at behavior management, taking off our behaviorist lenses, popping in our neuroscience lenses, just have a look at this lovely strategy. Our early career teachers love it because it's colourful and it's got, you know, every child's got a peg with their name on it. But if you're a trauma-impacted young person who's unresolved, this is just reinforcing there's something broken about you, and you'll never be able to climb that lovely, colourful ladder, and everyone in the room knows it. And that is doing harm, and it's not okay. So we need to problematize these things. We also, from this approach, we really focus on staff wellbeing. So we emphasize this. It's just as important to work on the people working with the kids as it is working with the kids. Okay, I'm going to very quickly tell you some of the systemic work I've been doing, because I really want to leave you with this today. this is just a sample of the work, but one of the big pieces of work we've done in recent years is to develop national guidelines for trauma-aware education. We held hands with the Australian Childhood Foundation to do a project on this a number of years ago, and we came up with 10 guidelines for schools and early childhood services and 10 guidelines for education systems like state education, Catholic education, independent schooling, all that sort of thing. So that was good, and it raised a lot of conversation across the country about the importance of this work. Oh, that's just an article that I wrote on it. My university then started to help me to develop learning opportunities. This was quite a while ago. I wrote a MOOC, which is a 2-hour free course. It's still available. And I basically wanted it to go out across this country to give all schools an introduction to this stuff, particularly like early in the year during their stuff, development days. But what happened was very unexpected, but very exciting. This course has now gone to over 167 countries and over 67,000 people have done this. So it really is saying how thirsty people out there are for this information, which just inspired me to do more work. So eventually I've developed this graduate certificate, and some of you might be interested in this. It's also can be embedded within a Master of Education degree, but it started in 2001, and it's initially the first of its kind in Australia, and I've been talking to other universities about developing this work now. So you'll see these popping up in other places. But we cover 5 units in this course. It's basically a year long, part-time. And the first one is an introductory course, and the second one focuses on the research that informs our work. The third one is the science, and I go into a lot more depth than what I've done today to teach that one. And then the fourth one is looking at different types of young people and kids and even adults who've been through different things and how we address the concerns of those kids. So it might be First Nations kids, it might be kids who are pregnant and parenting, kids who have disability and trauma, all the different categories. And then the final one is leading trauma-aware education. So developing the leadership capacity to do something with this work in their workplaces. So that's happening now. And it's really, we're getting more and more people sign up for that every year, which is lovely. Our students come from everywhere. Lots of different educators, but also people outside of education who are interested in the education piece for their clients or their families or whoever. And the entry requirements for the grad cert are very flexible, which I'm thrilled about. So you can either have a university degree in something or not, which is great. So we've got some people who have at least 2 years of professional work and a diploma, and some people who don't have any diploma, but they have 5 years of professional work. They can enter this course, which is great. So we get chaplains, we get youth workers, we get teacher aides, we get all sorts of people who have the lovely opportunity of getting their first university degree and to stand up on stage at the end of the year with a funny hat on and a big gown and graduate, which is always exciting. So we support these people because many of them either haven't studied for a long time at uni, or some of them have never. So we really sort of scaffold things to support them. And the really nice news about our pre-service teacher work is it's grown over the years. So it started off, the university didn't thoroughly trust me, and they just said, we'll just let you do a couple of electives. And so way back in 2017, 2018, it was just some electives that I ran for pre-service teachers. They became so popular and everyone was really cranky if they missed out on enrolling in those, that by 2019, the university said I could offer it to anyone in the Bachelor of Education or in the Bachelor of Education, and I could run it twice a year, so first and second semester, and we had hundreds and hundreds sign up. And then in 2020, the Master of Teaching cohort joined in and they had an elective. 2023, the Master of Teaching cohort, it became a core unit, so a mandatory unit. And just this year, our Bachelor of Education cohort, it is now a mandatory unit. So this is the first university to do this across our country. And again, I'm talking to lots of other universities about how they can do this, and they are working towards this. And we're really, really happy that we've achieved this milestone because it's been a long, long road getting there. I'm also developing a micro-credential right now that should be ready by next year, which is a smaller course where you can do a couple of units and that can lead you to entry into the grad cert if you want it. And we've got a new Birth to 5 course starting next year, and we've got a unit within that on trauma-aware education, which is really great. So if you look at this timeline here, I wrote a little book in 2013 that sparked a lot of interest, which led to me doing more and more and more and more work. So that one was very simple, easy to read text for busy educators. 2018, I did a big project for Queensland, which led to the national guidelines happening in 2021, which led to, amongst other things, my latest book, which is Trauma-Aware Education, Essential Information and Guidance for Educators, Education Sites and Education Systems, which is a more substantial text. I'm just currently working on a chapter for a national text for pre-service teacher education. I was invited to do this because they wanted to embed this into this very popular textbook for pre-service teacher education. They wanted a chapter on trauma-aware education, which is really lovely. And we're now working on national guidelines for higher education because increasingly we are becoming very aware that our adult learners, many of them have lived through childhood trauma, and many of them are living through current trauma, whether that's family violence, whether that's mental health concerns or whatever. And we need to respond in a trauma-informed way. So we're doing research and writing in that space now, which is really good. And then we have a whole lot of PhDs and other higher degree research projects that are continually happening every year to continue to contribute to the evidence base for this work. Well, this is really exciting. This is a big conference that we hold every 2 years. Our next one is on the 30th of October through to the 2nd of November. The web link is there, but you can just type in Trauma Aware Education Conference, you'll find it. There's a button on the website where you can just look for it. It's where you can sign up to be on the mailing list so we can send you updates. But it's a big conference. It's this is our 4th one, and it has huge impact across the country. So this one we've moved it from 2 days to 3 days because of how popular it is. The program comes out in August. We're including a conference dinner. We purposefully embed fun in this event because we're talking about a pretty heavy topic with incredible people, and of course there'll be trauma survivors in the room. So we make this as enjoyable and fun as we possibly can. So we have entertainment at our dinner, lots of prizes and giveaways and all sorts of things. There's just some photos and information about some of the speakers, but you can have a look at them on the details of them on the website. But when the program comes out, you'll see that there are a whole lot of other people from across the country who will be sharing, which is really exciting. And we actually got 3 times as many submissions for breakout sessions than we've had in the past, which is evidence of the work that's happening. So all of this systemic stuff that I'm jumping around doing, and we are jumping around doing, is basically to grow the next generation of leaders in this work, because it's not something that can start and stop. We have to keep addressing the impacts of childhood trauma, of harm that should never have happened to anyone when they were kids, and making sure those longer term impacts are addressed. So it's a systemic problem. It needs a systemic solution, and we're going to keep working on this, lifting the red line closer to the blue line for as many people as we possibly can do. So have a think about what this means for your role, maybe your places of work or your service, maybe the system you work for, and what are your spheres of influence? How can you talk about this stuff, share information on this stuff to the people who need to hear it? And the more and more we do that together, the greater the understanding and greater the capacity is to actually address this stuff for as many kids, many adults as we possibly can. Okay, I think that's all, and I'm going to stop sharing. So you can ask questions if you would like to. What are we up to? 12 minutes past 12. So I've got a little bit of time if anyone would like to ask a question. That was very fast and furious. I apologise for that.
It was fast and furious, Judith, but fascinating along the way. And thank you so much for including all that information about the science behind the trauma, because that provided such a good context for them what we need to be aware of. And I think one of the reasons we've got quite so many people in this session today is because the National Catholic Safeguarding Standards focus on being trauma-informed and a trauma-informed approach to safeguarding. So I think that from my perspective, what you've taught us about today has really brought me back thinking more about, well, what are we doing in terms of trauma? How are we thinking about trauma? So, but I need to open it for questions rather than talking about me. So what is the chat saying? Oh, thank you. Lovely comments from Tim and Heidi about how wonderful the course has been, how the session has been. Does anyone have any questions? Please just pipe up and ask. You don't need to put it into the chat. We're a small enough group. You can unmute yourself.
I find sometimes people think, oh, she's an associate professor, I better not ask a question because I'll look like I'm not clever enough. Please don't feel that way. I'm basically a very normal person. So I'm very, very approachable. So please, if you've got questions, they're always good questions.
So, and if you have any questions, you can always reach out to Kat or myself as well. But
or
questions.
I'm very happy for you to email me at QUT. So my email is ja.howard@qut.edu.au. If you have inquiries or questions that you feel you'd rather talk to me individually, that's absolutely fine too.
And thank you, Judith. I will put your email address into the email I send out to people so they don't have to scribble notes if they don't want to. But thank you very much for that. Will there be a separate presentation of the strategies to support children and young people?
Sarah, that's so funny because that's often the first question that comes up because people are so desperate for the strategies. I always suggest they've got to hear the science first. And so that's really important. I'm not sure if I'll be delivering a session on the strategies to this group, but the book, the latest book I've written, there's a whole chapter on strategies and we cover them in depth in our grad cert and all the rest of it. So it's really hard to get it across in such a brief time. But if you're really keen, you might want to look at chapter 5 in the book or some other things.
Well, other aspects. The other thing I'm thinking, Judith, if you don't mind, is we might ask you to come back next year and present on that because we're in the process of pulling ourselves together for our program next year. And that if there's enough demand, if you put it in your feedback, thinks that there's enough demand, then we'll get Judith back again to talk about that. Thank you.
Oh, Bianca's coming to the conference. Excellent. Come up and say hi to me when you're there, Bianca. Yeah. Hi. Jim, you have a question?
Yeah, thanks, Judith. Have you done any work with parents in relation to why these children are exhibiting some of these behaviours? My daughter's just started her first year as a prep teacher, and the stories she comes up with, unbelievable. One little girl is called a free spirit because that's what mum's called her. I wouldn't smack the child, I'd smack the parent. I know that's not acceptable in this day and age, but any work with parents?
Not so much. In the early days, I would speak, the child safety would get me to do different things to work with parents and families. Because my focus is on the education system and I'm so crazy busy just meeting that requirement, I don't usually do that. There are other wonderful people who do work in that space. The Circle of Security group are fantastic with parenting. There's a gentleman at my uni who runs training for parents, he trains people to work with parents, if that makes sense. And that's working on the secure-based safe haven stuff and really focusing on reading and responding to cues, which is a big challenge when you're unresolved from trauma yourself. But it helps parents be able to see that for what it is and be able to adjust their behaviour. So the Circle of Security group are fantastic. Now they're a global group, but there is definitely a Brisbane base as well. So you can do some Googling and find them, but they work with that. Their whole thing is parenting. Yeah. So as much as I'd love to work with everybody, I'm so busy just doing education that no, I don't get to do that.
You can't spread yourself too thin.
I feel like I do it all day.
I know.
Uh,
Well, if there are no further questions, Judith, I just want to say a huge thank you. It was such a privilege to have you come and present to us. And I'm sure it's really started all of our thoughts and our minds racing as to what we can do in our different roles. This group is an enormous group of different roles, so everyone's going to come away with a different takeaway. Everyone's going to have a different way of implementing what you've said. So thank you so much for that. For everyone else that is left in the presentation, I do want to mention that we do have on the ACSL website a trauma-informed safeguarding module, which talks about some of the concepts that Judith has mentioned, but talks about how you can approach safeguarding from that perspective. And again, if you wish to register for it, you just hop online, it's all free. So thank you. And I will be sending out an email with a link to the recording and Judith's details. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. And Judith, good luck with the conference. I hope it goes really well.
Thank you so much, Kendra, and Kat, for looking after me too.